Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us for today's service. If you were here last week, you know that we're doing a series on the Sermon on the Mount, with religion being so crazy in our nation right now, and so many people using the name of Jesus to call to hatred of others, to call for domination of others. And when that's done in the name of the church, I think it's very, very important to speak up with the original message, both, on behalf of the people that are being vilified by the church, but also for ourselves to remember the core of the message, that there is a message of love underneath the different teachings. And way before the creeds were written, there was a Sermon on the Mount. And I think whenever religion gets kind of crazy, that's kind of a home base that we can return to. Last week we looked at the Beatitudes, which blessed are the poor, blessed are the weak, which is Jesus redefining what happiness means. Because people existed in a time of empire, it was very important for them to learn that value doesn't come from wealth and that right doesn't come from might. So that's what we were looking at last week. This week we're looking at a very strange phrase that Jesus says right after the Beatitudes, that the people listening to him are the light of the world. The reason that's important is because the people that Jesus was speaking to were the outcasts of the culture, as best we can figure. These were the rejected people, the people enslaved, women, different groups that didn't get fully honored were the ones most likely to hear Jesus' message of the love that does justice. And so in a time when we feel despair, when we feel helpless, I think getting back to the original message spoken to people in a very similar situation where there was an empire that was in decay, there were systems of power that were in decay, and that there was both the terror and the fear of the people being oppressed, but also a hope of a new age that was being born during this time. So we have both the sense that the Calvary isn't coming, that the systems we counted on the past to save democracy may or may not be there for us. At the same time, we're being told that there's something inside us that can handle this. That in addition to being sometimes political pawns, people very small and powerless in many ways, we're also cosmic events. We are literally the universe being made conscious, being aware. And I think that in many of the ancient poems of this time, the cosmic poetry of the time, light shining out of the darkness was human consciousness coming out of the material world. That whatever you believe about God or not God, or religion or not religion, there's a very strange fact that our very consciousness, our very being, comes out of this dark mystery. And so because we come from that depth, even though we may be in unfair times, we may be in dangerous times, that we must never forget that we are also cosmic events. We are expressions of the deep, whatever that intelligence is. We call it math sometimes, we call it harmony, we call it all kinds of things, but there is a kind of intelligence or a shaping or a patterning that underlies the universe and shapes it and guides it. And so I think part of what Jesus is saying is never forget that you are that. You are an expression of whatever that sacred ground of being is, so that you don't have to go looking for that as though it were lost or you were lost. You are an expression of the thing that you're looking for. I think the Sermon on the Mount gets us back to our roots, because this is the most direct contact we have with the actual words of Jesus. So, looking at this passage today, and remembering that the people listening to this word would be the ones had the hardest time believing it and hearing it. That the people who were enslaved, the people that were impoverished, the people that were sick, the people that struggled with physical disabilities, were all expressions of this profound cosmic mystery and could not be defined by the oppressions of their time, the unfairness of their time. So Jesus was furthering some comments by Isaiah, where Isaiah himself felt that he was born to bring this message to his time. He said, "In the womb, you shaped me for this." And he hears God calling him to send out this light to the world. It may be him that's being talked about. It may be Israel that's being talked about. It may be humanity that's being talked about. But that somehow we must not forget that even when we look around us and we can't see any light or hope, that we ourselves are expressions of a kind of light and a kind of hope. When we think about ourselves, a lot of times we judge ourselves by very inhumane standards. We think we're too young, or we're too old, we're too weak, we're not educated enough. And this is calling us to something deeper than that. And this is the faith of somebody like Gandhi, who faced incredibly overwhelming odds, had no idea whether he was going to be successful or not, but had complete confidence in the message that he was bringing to the world of love and compassion and justice. And I think Jesus is saying we can have that same kind of faith and compassion. And in fact, Gandhi once said something very similar to what Jesus is saying, which is that in the times of the most darkness, when he looked around him and he couldn't see any hope or light or wisdom, that in many ways he was most in touch with the light within himself, because he wasn't looking outside of himself to find it. The Lutheran pastor Martin Niemöller, we usually, when we hear him quoted, it's the thing, "They came for the communists and I didn't say anything because I wasn't a communist. They came for the trade unions. I didn't say anything because I wasn't a member of the trade unions. They came for the Jewish people. I didn't do anything because I wasn't Jewish. And then when they came for me, there was nobody left to speak up for me." This Lutheran pastor living in the time of fascism, a time when a charismatic leader has displaced all kinds of sense of civics, all kinds of sense of decency. And the one standard is whether the leader likes you or not, whether you're loyal to the leader or not. It was a time very similar to our own. And this is where the church had to make decisions. Now, Niemöller was not perfect, and we can look back and find all kinds of disturbing things that he said and believed. But this much he was in touch with was that phrase, "You're the light of the world," is something that could give him hope, even facing persecution. He says to his church, this is a sermon that he gave called "You Are the Light of the World." What are we worried about? What are we worrying about? When I read out the names of church members missing or arrested, did we not think, alas and alack, will this wind, this storm that is going through the world right now, not blow out the gospel candle? We must therefore take the message in out of the storm and keep it safe. It is during these days that I've realized, that I've understood what Christ meant when he said, "Do not take up the bushel. I have not lit the candle for you to put it under the bushel. In order to protect it from the wind, away with the bushel. The light should be placed upon a candlestick. We are not to worry whether the light is extinguished or not. That is God's concern. We are only to see that the light is not hidden away. Let your light shine before humanity." Now, this was a very dangerous time, and that took some courage to say that. And I think that we live in a similar time where the message isn't something you find in a holy scripture. It's not something you find written objectively down. It's the expression of what it means to be a human being. That when we hear the cry, "Black Lives Matter," that's an expression of human dignity in the face of political indignities. It's somebody saying, my humanity counts and is the standard by which justice is measured. There's not some external standard which a human soul is weighed. So whatever the human right is, it's universal. It applies to everybody, everywhere. And so when you express your authentic humanity, even if you can't see the results of what you're doing, you are calling for a new age. Every time you recognize the humanity of another human being whose value is being questioned, you are an ambassador for a new world. As I said, Mahatma Gandhi said that sometimes this is easiest to see when there is nothing but darkness around us, when there's no hope, there's no clarity. That at that time we realize most of all that we need to trust this voice within us. He said, while everything around me is ever changing, ever dying, there's underlying that change a living power that is changeless, that holds all together, that creates, dissolves, and recreates. For I can see in the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists. In the midst of darkness, light persists. So these are ways of saying the same truth in different ways. When Jesus said, I'm the light of the world, when he more specifically said that you are the light of the world, this is a universal message. It's not just Christianity that understands these truths. When Martin Luther King was in prison, he studied Buddhism. And the way I know that is he quoted Buddha sometimes without necessarily giving reference passages. But when he said, darkness cannot cast out darkness, only light can do that. When he said, hate cannot cast out hate, only love can do that. He was quoting directly from Buddha's Dhammapada. And very similar to what Jesus is saying, which is when we see the lies around us, we don't have to do counter propaganda. We just merely need to be authentic and truthful. When we see cruelty around us, we don't need to find a greater cruelty to crush it. We need only keep our own human compassion alive and intact. That's what it means to not put the light under a bushel, to protect the light. It's very human to think that love is so tender, so gentle. It's like a flower. And it is in many ways, but that energy of life underneath the flower is incredibly powerful. And even though individual flowers come and go, individual birds of the sky come and go, that parade of life, that celebration of life is something that is invincible. Isaiah, when he looked at the injustice of his time, felt he was called to that time, that he didn't have to look around him for an external light. He felt he was a light, that the truth within him, the authenticity, the humanity within him was a light. And I think that's much of what Jesus is saying to the weak, the powerless, the sick, to you and to me, that there's none of us that are useless. There are none of us too small. The fact that we're going to die is very, very important when we're trying to calculate what has meaning and what doesn't. When you go back to Reverend Niemöller, people like him, ministers like him, were risking their very lives to speak the truth. This is bigger than Christianity. This is the truth of humankind. And to realize that when we look back in those days, the people that survived or didn't survive, that distinction, which at the time was ultimate for many people, looking back, that's not what was important. What was important is which side of that struggle were people on. Were they on the side of domination and power and ignorance enforcing itself through the law? Or were they on the side of truth and gentleness in humankind, whatever the cost. Because it's true that the victims of the Nazi Holocaust died. It's also true that the perpetrators of the Nazi Holocaust died. It's true that the people that resisted Nazism died, but it's true that the people that defended it, that collaborated with it, died as well. When all is said and done, what's more important than what we die of is what we die for, what we live for, what we give ourselves for. And that's what Jesus is, I think, trying to say to ourselves. Your expression of a deep truth, simply because you're human, simply because your life itself in expression. And when you're authentic, which means to be truthful, which means to be artistic, creative, to not become a machine in order to survive, that when you speak that truth, when you sing that beauty, you are a light to the whole world. And so I think what Jesus is saying in conclusion is when we look around us and we see nothing but darkness, we see no hope coming from the Calvary to the side, to realize that's not a signal for us to despair. That's our cue to shine. Because as much as we look around us and we see good reasons to despair, if we go more profoundly and more deeply into who we are, we're also cosmic events. We're the expressions of something that is timeless, eternal. And when we are faithful to that, when we are expressions of that, when we realize that truth, goodness, and beauty are what give our lives meaning, for however long that is, then we realize we were born for this. Like Isaiah said, we have what it takes to get through it. We merely need to be authentic. And so when we look around us, we see nothing but darkness. Again, that's not the signal to despair. It's our cue to shine. I invite you now to your own reflection on these words.